All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. Uh, my name is Elizabeth Underhill, and I am from the Museums of Mississauga. I am here tonight with our very special guests, Lawrence Hill and Natasha Henry, who have a wonderful conversation planned for you this evening. Joining us tonight is my co-host, Saima Hussein from the Mississauga Library, and our moderator, Megan Press. We are very happy that you could join us tonight. And before I turn it over to Saima, I'm going to bring up another PowerPoint. So bear with me for just one moment while I get this ready for you, and then Saima has something to share with you.
Welcome, everyone. So before we begin, I would like to share the Mississauga Library's Land Acknowledgement Statement. We acknowledge the land on which we stand is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation Territory, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa sovereign nations. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, as well as the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work with the community on this territory.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And just before we introduce our speakers this evening, we have a little bit of a housekeeping presentation to share with you. So we will do that now. Just bringing up the slide. And I apologize, my computer is a little bit slow this evening. Okay, there, I hope you can see that now. So tonight, you're joining us from WebEx events, so thank you so much for diving into this platform with us. I know it's not used very frequently, so we just want to familiarize you a little bit with what you're going to be seeing tonight. So presentation should look something like this on your screens. And I apologize. Now, when you're looking for us, your presenters, you should see us hanging out at the top of the screen here. Now, you may have noticed that your mics are muted during the event, but we do welcome a Q&A. We will be saving about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this event for Q&A. And you can enter your questions into this box at the bottom. Now, if it gets closed, you can open it again down at the bottom of your screen here. So just to acquaint you with this format. Let me just see here. Okay, so I'll stop sharing this for you now. I hope that is enough of a housekeeping presentation for you all. And well, let's see here. So, okay, I'm just acquainting myself. Thank you for your patience. On to the show. This talk is being presented in partnership by the Museums of Mississauga and the Mississauga Library as part of our online speaker series. The museums are thrilled to present tonight's program in conjunction with Warflowers, an immersive, multi-sensory exhibition that focuses on the stories of 10 Canadians in the First World War. This is on view now until December 13th at the Living Arts Centre in Mississauga. Pre-booked tickets are available through the Living Arts Centre box office. This talk also complements the exhibition Our Boys, on view at the Bradley Museum and Benares Historic House. This exhibition reflects on the soldiers from Mississauga who lost their lives in the First World War. Oh.
Pleased to offer today's program in partnership with Museums of Mississauga, which also kickstarts the library's fall lineup of Author Talk series. Our goal is to connect readers in Mississauga with some of their beloved authors and provide them an opportunity to learn about their writing, and ask questions. So thank you all for being here tonight, and we hope that you will continue to join us in this fall. Details about the series are available on the library's website. And now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce our guest author. Lawrence Hill joins us this evening to share insight on his current project, which is a novel about the little-known story of African-American soldiers who built the Alaska Highway in British Columbia and the Yukon during World War II. He will be joined in conversation by Natasha Henry, president of the Ontario Black History Society, to discuss the Black diaspora in Canada, contributions of Black Canadians and African Americans in times of war, and Lawrence Hill's experiences with writing about Black history in Canada. Lawrence Hill is the author of 10 books, including The Illegal, The Book of Negroes, and Blackberry Sweet Juice on being Black and white in Canada. He is the recipient of many awards, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and CBC Radio's Canada Reads. He is a professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph. A member of the Order of Canada, he lives with his wife Miranda Hill, also a writer, in Hamilton and in Newfoundland.
And we are delighted to welcome Natasha Henry, who is an educator, historian, and curriculum consultant. Natasha is the president of the Ontario Black History Society, and she is currently completing a PhD in history at York University, researching the enslavement of Africans in early Ontario, and she is a 2018 Vanier Scholarship recipient. Through her various professional, academic, and community roles, Natasha's work is grounded in her commitment to research, collect, preserve, and disseminate the histories of Black Canadians. Now let's get started. Natasha, I invite you to open the conversation.
It's wonderful to be here this evening. So thank you for the introductions. And I'm really excited to be here in conversation with Lawrence Hill this evening. The opportunity for two of us who are very passionate about Black history to have a chat and to talk about our work and to talk about Black history in Canada. So thank you very much. So let's start with that. Tell me, Lawrence, about your interest and your work in Black history.
Well, first of all, thank you, Natasha, for joining us, and thank you so much to the Mississauga Library for making this possible and for inviting us both to enter into this conversation. I know we've had a chance to chat and meet before in person, but it's really nice to see you again remotely, although it would have been nice to be in person again. And as you and I both know, but perhaps the viewers tonight don't, we're actually quite deeply connected through the Ontario Black History Society and through, of course, our mutual interest in Black history in Canada. In your case, of course, as the audience just heard, you're the president of the OBHS. In my case, my parents, Daniel and Donna Hill, co-founded the Ontario Black History Society in 1978. My dad had done a thesis at the U of T, a PhD thesis. The dissertation was called Negroes in Toronto, a Sociological Survey. And that was quite groundbreaking and novel at the time to be writing a U of T, dissertation about the story of African Canadians in Toronto. And after writing that thesis, he went on to, run the Ontario Human Rights Commission, but also to co-founder with my mother and other good friends the OBHS. And I worked quite actively as a volunteer with the OBHS for some years. So we have that kind of connection to the society. So it's, again, really nice to see you tonight.
Yes, you have a longer history than I do to the organization, and it's great that we continue to be members, and that the society remains ever relevant today, and that we are continuing work, great work in the legacy of those, including your parents, who started an organization that has really been become an institution. So thank you for that. For me, having the opportunity to be a part of an organization with this focus helps me to channel my energies right into a passion that I have, and to help grow interest, public interest, and public awareness. Because even though the Ontario Black history has been around now, it's going to be 43 years. There's still a lot of Canadians who are not aware of the extensive history of African descended people here in Canada and in Ontario.
Yeah, there sure aren't. And it's funny because one of the projects that most excited me as a volunteer back in the late 70s and early 80s, when I was involved with the Black History Society, was to go out and tape older Black Canadians and they tape record their memories of their stories. And I found it absolutely fascinating. And although you and I both know that there are reams of written materials and documents relating to Black history in this country, there are also many stories that are at risk of being lost forever, and many of those stories are best documented orally. And of course, some of my most fascinating discoveries as I write have come through oral interviews, and I know from connections with other people, such as the Hidden History Society, which explores Black and other histories in Yukon and other parts of the country, how much oral history and getting down the stories of people is a vital source of research for novelists and scholars like you. So I just wanted to add that pitch for the value of oral history.
And I'm not sure if you know, but those recordings, the amazing recordings, are in the process slowly of being digitized, and so that they become more available, with the new technology. Because, as you said, just just the ability to have access to that history through the voices and the experiences of individuals is really something that's quite powerful. And we talk about, the documentation and the preservation of this history and the multifaceted experiences of Black people in the province. For me, I find that, going into the archives, some of the archives that exist as well, and extracting some of these stories from those documents is really something amazing, as you can attest to. For me, I'm doing that through my PhD research on enslavement in Ontario. And although it's not, I don't have the ability to tap into the voices of those who were enslaved, a strong focus of my work is to present narratives and stories in a way that brings them into that history.
Yeah, well, those narratives of fugitive slaves, for example, are some of the most fascinating documents, in our histories. But I'll just add a playful personal note, and that is that you're so right about how getting access to these taped interviews, whether they're digitized or in the old style, it adds a whole nother layer of understanding and appreciation for our history. And I learned something about my father after he passed away. And I was asked by the Ontario Archives to sort of curate an exhibition about his papers and his life. And so I did so. And part of the exhibition online is to feature a few of the tape recordings that were done of him giving interviews while he was head of the Ontario Black History Society and leading the Ontario Human Rights Commission. This in the, starting in the early 1960s, right through, the 80s. And I didn't even realize that my father, an American immigrant to Canada, had a distinct Southern accent because I hadn't really noticed it as a child. But after he died, and one day I started listening to one of those tapes that my father had done when he was being interviewed by CBC about Black history in Canada, and I heard this really ringing Southern accent, which I'd never picked up on as a kid because I grew up with it. It almost took some distance and listened to his voice digitized like that before I realized my father had that really distinct Southern accent. It was a fascinating discovery, right in my own family.
Mm-hmm. And how do you, when you mentioned your dad, how did you come to history or to learn about Black experiences through his life?
Sure. Well, I mean, my parents as you know, black father, white mother, married and left the United States the day after they married in 1953 in the South, and came to Canada to forge a life here. They sort of had a capacity to laugh about some of the most hideous problems and difficulties they'd encountered. My father is an African American soldier in the Second World War for the United States forces, and my mother, of course, witnessing, anti-black racism, and she was fighting the civil rights fight in the States before she came to Canada. And although they'd had many losses and suffered many losses and didn't win every fight they embarked upon by any means, they had an ability to joke and laugh about it, even the things that they'd lost. Maybe that helped them get through. So my parents, my father especially, were really great storytellers and could recount and just know how to withhold a little juicy bit of a story to the last minute and keep me on the edge of my bed listening to amazing stories about their fights. I mean, my father had to go to the Supreme Court of Canada to fight an anti-discrimination case against a black man who was refused lodging in Toronto because he was black. And my father was trounced in the Supreme Court. He lost the case terribly. And this was with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. But he found a way to come home and laugh about it because it was just so pathetic and pitiful. It sort of reminds me of the things we're going through now. I mean, when we look at, say, what's going on in the United States, we know that things might not get better tomorrow, but and in Canada too, of course. We know that things might not get better immediately, but if my parents and my ancestors could have faith that eventually things would improve, I can have faith too. And it gives me some strength to think of the long haul that they were involved in. They knew, as did my grandfather and great grandfather and grandmother, that they wouldn't find immediate resolution to their struggles to end racism, but they still kept on, even though they knew it would be a long fight. So sometimes we just have to resign ourselves to being in a long fight.
Yes. So from your dad's experience, how does it connect to, how does his experience, his life experience connect to the history of soldiers and veterans, Black soldiers and veterans?
Well, I mean, you know a lot more than I do about African Canadian soldiers in the world wars and in other wars. But my grandfather was an African American officer in the First World War and fought and was hurt, in the trenches of France. And my father was an American soldier in the Second World War. And so there's a personal family history and a deep personal recognition of the incredibly embedded racism, that Canadian and American soldiers and others faced in the world wars, for example. So it's a deeply personal story for me, and I'm coming back to it, which we can examine a little later in our conversation, to do with the building of the Alaska Highway in northern BC, Yukon, and Alaska during the Second World War. But it's got a deeply personal root, and of course, I've dug around some of the work with the Ontario Black History Society to learn more about how this spun off, in places such as Oakville, Ontario, in the 1930s and beyond. But we can come back to that in a minute if you'd like.
Yes, yeah, we can come back to that. I do wanted to mention here too that in having this conversation about soldiers and veterans, that this week is Veterans Week, and there continues to be recognition of the contributions of men and women in different conflicts that the Canadian military was part of. And that in these commemorations, we still do not often see inclusion or recognition of veterans, of soldiers, of various backgrounds, and particularly here, Black Canadian soldiers. There continues to be this gap in this history, and I connect that to, again, getting back to the point that I mentioned earlier around. There still isn't a groundswell of public knowledge of the 400-year presence of Black people in what is now Canada and what was previously, French and British colonies. We have an over 400-year history of various waves of migration of people of African descent.
It's so true, and I sometimes say that you could interview a 15-year-old or a 55-year-old in Dawson City or Whitehorse or Winnipeg, Toronto, St. John's, you name it, and most people would be able to trot out at least a few lines about African American history, about slavery in the United States, about the civil rights movement in the United States. They'd know some of the key figures in African American history, but those same people who could trot out at least a cogent paragraph about these things south of the border could usually tell you next to nothing about slavery, segregation, and the long fight for racial justice in Canada. And so, unfortunately, that this continues to be an issue. And of course, when I was growing up, I was born in 57, but in the 60s, when I'm growing up and attending public schools in Toronto, I can assure you there was absolutely no reference whatsoever to Black history, in the schools that I was attending. And the only reason I became knowledgeable about it was because my parents, taught me and excited me about this history.
Yes, I hope you had the opportunity to see the campaign last week that the Ontario Black History Society that we kicked off, Blacked Out History, really to create a visual of what you just said, right? That, we need to have some explicit, some mandated learning around this history that's brought into the curriculum, through the curriculum, and of course, supplemented by a range of experiences and materials, but that we can finally get some kind of an intervention in that regard, so that we do have a more knowledgeable citizenry around this history. And we've been getting a good response, a really great response to that campaign, and sparking some awareness and interest in that. Because as you mentioned, there's, we're looking at the 400 years, we have a history of enslavement, right, as we talk about, but we also have, a range of other groups. There's Black loyalists, looking at your work, your work on the Book of Negroes, the Black refugees who came after in World War of 1812, Jamaican Maroons, and then the huge wave of freedom seekers coming in mid-19th century, and subsequent waves of migration, and the the Black Oklahomans who migrated into the prairie provinces at the turn of the 20th century into Alberta and Saskatchewan and so forth.
And we tried our best. The Canadian government, tried its best to keep them out. And by the way, for those who don't know, there's a fantastic new documentary film by my friend and fellow writer Cheryl Fogo, a wonderful Black writer out of Calgary, whose documentary John Ware Reclaimed was just put out by the National Film Board. And for those of you who haven't seen it, check out John Ware Reclaimed. It's a terrific documentary about a Black a 19th century cowboy in Alberta. Really great story.
Yes, I saw you in it. I watched it a couple of weekends ago. It is phenomenal. Cheryl did such a great job. It was, I watched it the late morning on a Saturday, and it just sat with me for the entire weekend. It was really, she touched on the history. She touched on the descendants, the importance of recording and documenting Black history in this manner. It's an amazing resource, and I'm looking forward to it becoming more widely available for everyone to have the opportunity to see it.
Yeah, it reminded me of how much story is still one of the best ways to draw people into history. It's not the only way, but if you can sort of add color and personal struggle to a story, you're likely to excite and interest a lot more readers and people of all ages than if you're just presenting a series of dry facts. And we have this idea, at least I had this notion, that Canadian history was so boring, it was almost a violation of my constitutional rights. When I was a child, I just hated the idea of studying history because I thought it was nothing more than a recitation of dates and places. But once I started to dig into history myself, to research books and then to learn more, I started seeing all the color and personal struggle in history. And of course, that's our job as artists, as filmmakers or novelists, poets, whatever, is to invest those stories with great personal and idiosyncratic struggle. That's what excites people a lot.
Yes, It does. Absolutely, it does. So, how did you come to be interested in your latest project? How did, what stories drew you to this history of African American soldiers building the highway?
Well, I'm not a historian. Like, I don't have a PhD in history, and I don't claim to be a historian, but I'm very interested in history, and it seems to keep inserting itself into my books, whether I I want it to or not. And I think the kind of history that really turns me on as a novelist is an aspect of, say, African Canadian, African American history. I'm interested in the connections between the two countries and the other countries in the African diaspora too. So I'm not interested just in Canada, but how we connect to other countries. And then I'm interested in finding stories that are hardly known at all to most Canadians, but that do have significant documentation behind them. So you can actually learn and educate yourself a lot, as a novelist, if you really dig into there and meet knowledgeable people and do the work and the research, and then finding a way to dramatize those stories that are just relatively unknown to most Canadians. Now, if you happen to be a Yukoner or a person in northern BC and you're interested in history and you're open to the stories of Black people in Canada, then you probably know this story. But if you don't live in Yukon, you're probably not aware that thousands of African American soldiers came up to northern BC and Yukon during one of the coldest winters on record, 1942-43, to build the 1,500-mile Alaska Highway from Dawson Creek, BC, snaking up through Whitehorse and into Fairbanks, Alaska. This highway being built to fight off an anticipated invasion of Japanese soldiers who were feared to attack Alaska and then come marauding down the continent during the Second World War. And of course, that attack didn't materialize, but that's why the highway was built, to fight off an imagined or perceived attack by the Japanese, who were our enemies in war. And so we have thousands of Black people, on the orders of their superiors, trampling through the lands of Indigenous people, building the Alaska Highway in this year. And so it's a really incredible story. And I've been helped by all sorts of wonderful people in BC and Yukon, including the members of the Hidden History Society and in Whitehorse and elsewhere, Paul Gowdy and Lillian Nakamura McGuire and their colleagues, and many other people who've helped me sort of learn this story, and I've been reading about it. So it's a story that's just so unknown, which involves kind of integration of Black, Indigenous, and white communities, in a time in which nobody's paying any mind as these Indigenous lands are being trampled, as this highway is being laid down, which has a permanent impact on Indigenous people in the far north. So it's a story of Black people in the far north, which is unknown to most Canadians. In one of the coldest winters on record. On top of that.
Mhm. So, what are some of maybe share a little tidbit of a story that from your research?
Well, there was the soldiers. They had to bring up, like, if you can imagine, like, massive bulldozers and tractors and huge, massive military machines to build this provisional highway through the Canadian North. And of course, they have no idea what they're doing. And building over tundra is just a disaster if you don't know what you're doing, because as soon as you start to dig down into it, permafrost, the material just turns to mud and can suck in and totally paralyze even major tractors and bulldozers and the like. And so they're just in a quagmire of mud until they can figure out how to lay materials down over it rather than digging into it. But one of the horrific details about the war that I learned is that there's one of the pieces of equipment right there. Thank you, Elizabeth. Is that when they were finished and they're ready to return south after their year of building, they couldn't be troubled to haul all this crap back to the United States. They just dumped it in the lakes and rivers of BC and Yukon and Alaska. They just dumped it, all this material, including, of course, all the toxic waste that they had with them. And so that's a pretty disturbing and horrific story to imagine. All this kind of military waste is just dumped into the far north because nobody can be bothered hauling it back to where it came from. And as you go through these pictures, you'll see a big hill. You can just keep scrolling forward, Elizabeth, if you don't mind. And there it is. Go back one, please, Elizabeth. Yeah, that's called Suicide Hill. That's that hill is so steep that you can imagine some people at risk of dying as they're plummeting down that thing in these rickety military machines from World War II. That was Suicide Hill, and that gives you an idea about the roughness of the highway. Again, it was called a highway, but really, when it was first built in 42, 43, it was just a military road to allow for military vehicles to carry arms and gasoline and munitions to fight off this anticipated invasion of Japanese soldiers.
Mhm. And I guess through through your research, you've seen that some of the conditions that Black soldiers faced in their in their push to serve in the military, or the Canadian or the American, World War I, World War II, that they faced, I guess, similar conditions. Looking at the history of the #2 Construction Battalion and how they were, relegated as a labor unit, and even at first that many of these men were being turned away from enlisting at the time when the war started, until the military was in great need of of additional people to work. However, they were not allowed to serve in the front lines, but rather to serve in these capacities. And then even when they came back as veterans, that they faced, the ongoing battle of racial discrimination as people who sacrificed their lives.
Yeah, well, this is what's so dramatic about the war and in the involvement of African Canadians and African Americans in those war efforts. Because on one hand, let's remember, this is really important to understand, that most ordinary African Americans and African Canadians at the outbreak of the two world wars were desperate to serve if they could. Why? They want to prove their equality and their commitment as Canadians and Americans. They want to prove that they are devoted citizens, and they believed naively that if they just risked their lives and went to war and served with honor their countries, that after the war they'd be treated finally with equality. And so there's a huge push in Black communities to volunteer for the war effort. And not only are they initially refused, or in every hurdle imaginable is erected to prevent their entry into things like, say, the Air Force in the Second World War, that kind of thing, but even their blood is not allowed to be donated to people who've been injured, say, if you're talking about the United States, or bans on the use of Black blood. If you're talking about saving a life of, say, a white soldier, not allowed to donate their blood to a white soldier at a time that we're finally able to donate blood in large quantities and have it be used in military situations. So it's a huge slap in the face to Black citizenry in both countries. But still, as you know, some people managed to serve, and just like the #2 Construction Battalion, these regiments in northern BC and Yukon, they're unarmed, and they're work battalions, they're engineering regiments, they're building highways, and they're equipped very poorly. The equipment that they're given is far inferior to that given to white soldiers who are also up there building the highway. Initially, many of them are sent up. You think about Yukon, -40 on a wickedly cold day, and they're working in rubber boots, and they're coming from military bases in the deep South, Louisiana, Georgia,
Mhm.
South Carolina. So you can imagine the shock, and not to mention the danger to their bodies to be poorly equipped like that in these cold winters. That's a great shot too. I like that one very much. Can we scroll back to the map for a second, Elizabeth? There's a map that shows this highway snaking up. I think it's the first slide actually. There it is. The next one, please. It's a little more detailed. No, the other way maybe. There we are. So there's Dawson Creek, BC, right near the Alberta border in northern BC, just a little shy of the northern Rocky Mountains. And the highway snakes up through Fort Nelson and Watson Lake, right on the border there. And then it comes up through Teslin and uh, in through Whitehorse and Haines Junction, some of the most beautiful areas in the world, and then keeps going in a northwesterly direction towards Beaver Creek, right on the U.S.-Canada border, and then finally finishes in Fairbanks, Alaska. So it's about 1,500 miles long, and it took about 10,000 soldiers were involved in building it and a pipeline to go along with it. And about half of them were African American, and the other half were white. They were kept apart from each other for the most part. And so that's just a picture of the route of the Alaska Highway. I've driven every kilometer of that highway with various family members, my daughter Carolyn and my son Andrew, and it's just an incredible thing. And I've met some fantastic people along the way. So it's a long project, but I'm still in the middle of it.
So tell me a little bit about the research. So you've done field research. You've gone onto the highway. How did you gather, or have you gathered so far some information? And have there been any challenges in your research as you research to uncover some of these stories?
Yeah, have there been any challenges, like maybe the pandemic? I was supposed to be up there in April, and I'd hoped to spend another couple of months in this spring and come back again this fall. So obviously, I haven't been able to travel, to Yukon and northern BC since the pandemic took over the world. The research has been a combination, like every book, meeting people, talking to people. I've met with many Indigenous elders along the way to ask some questions about their experiences and understand more about how the highway affected Indigenous people, what memories Indigenous people might have of those Black soldiers who are traveling through these lands. So some of it's been oral, has just been meeting people and getting people's memories down. Some of it has been in archives, in the Dawson City archives, and the archives in Whitehorse, and of course, other archives in other parts of the country. And much of it's been reading articles, newspaper articles of the day, scholarly articles, books. There is a great deal of information about the building of the highway and about the role of Black soldiers, but it's just that very few Canadians and Americans have heard about it and know about it.
Mm-hmm. Just one of the profiles that I saw on the Hidden History online exhibit was a gentleman, an artist he said he was biracial, African American, African descent, and Indigenous. And so, just in you mentioning that, I think about the interactions of, the Black soldiers and the Indigenous communities in the Yukon area and northern BC. But that history still remains with us today.
Yeah, I've been interviewing people who are the product of, Black soldiers were forbidden from going near white communities, near white people, or near Indigenous people. But of course, life is life, and romance gets in the way of all sorts of restrictions. And there were a few nocturnal connections, let's say, between African American soldiers and Indigenous women. And I know this because I've interviewed the children of those, brief nocturnal meetings, and those children are people who are in their 70s now, who were born during the time of the war. And so I have personally met and interviewed some people who descend from those unions. And so it's a fascinating story, and it's certainly populating my novel.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. I'm sure that others would love to have the opportunity to ask a few questions about your research or anything that we've talked about thus far this evening. So I would invite listeners to share your questions. And Megan, I think you will provide us with the steps on how they can do that.
Thanks, Natasha. So we've been collecting the questions. I do have a few. If anyone has any more, feel free to drop them into the chat box. The first question, it is important as a writer to find a way to connect to their audience. When your purpose is to educate them about Black history, what do you do to connect to your white audience? I believe that was directed to you, Mr. Hill.
Sorry, what do I do to connect to, but I didn't hear the last couple words. What do I do to connect to whom?
To your white audience.
Oh, well, when I'm writing a novel, I'm just thinking about satisfying myself and reaching an audience. And I want to be read by Black readers, and I want to influence the state of awareness and interest in Black history and in Black people in this country and in other countries. But I'm not thinking solely or specifically or just of Black people when I'm writing. I'm just mostly trying to satisfy myself and to get down a good story, a story that I would want to read if I were the reader. And although yes, I very much have educational aspirations, and I am a professor, of creative writing at the University of Guelph. So I'm a teacher, and I care very much about that role, and try to be a really committed and good teacher. Um, you have to be careful as a novelist, as an artist, not to be too overt or not to be too didactic when you're writing a story. It will show up if you're trying to sort of push a pill down a person's throat. And so I very much hope that people will learn a great deal about Black history and Black people and Black struggle through my works. But I have to be careful to sort of embed that subtly, in the story, as opposed to making a reader feel, oh, now I'm getting a history lesson. I'm all for history lessons, but a novel isn't the place to deliver one in an overt fashion, nor is a feature film. And so you have to be subtle about it and work it into the story. So a person just salivating for that story and wants the story and ingests all that other great stuff is almost a byproduct of engaging with a drama. And that's my opinion. I'm not sort of speaking for how other people should write, but so when you ask how I might speak to a white reader, fundamentally, I speak to a white reader for the most part the same way I'd speak to a Black reader. I want to engage them and excite them and make them knowledgeable about this history, which is Canadian history. It's not just Black history, it's Canadian history. And of course, it's history that connects to many other countries as well, in Africa, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Great Britain. And so I'm very interested in those connections and try to find ways to be dramatically engaging so that a person will naturally step in and just say, yeah, let me have more of this.
Great, thanks for your answer to that. I have a question from, it sounds like another writer. Mr. Hill, you obviously do a lot of research for your novels. What sort of plotting do you do, and how do you go about choosing the correct point of view for your characters?
Well, that's an easy one. What sort of plotting do I do, and how do I choose the right point of view for the characters? Well, trial and error. I usually screw up a few times, before I feel I've got it right. I could sit at the kitchen table and scratch my chin and have a great coffee or 500 coffees for 500 days and try to come up with a story, but it would never really be that good. It would never really work or stand the test of edits and time and revisions. And so kind of coming up with a story intellectually, like just plotting it, doesn't usually work very well for me. Again, I'm not telling any other person how to construct a novel, but I find the best way, obviously I have to have a sense of where the story is beginning and where it's ending and, have some kind of vision in mind. But I find the best way is just to jump in and start writing. And writing for me is a way of tunneling, is a way of finding my own story. And therefore, I have to write many drafts because the first ones are very messy and sloppy and wander all over the place and don't really get to where I want them to go to. But they help me open up my own vision. And so the writing process is what I find is most instrumental to revealing plot to me. Much more productive than if I just sit at the table, have a coffee, scratch my chin, and wonder, well, what will my plot be? That never gives a good answer. But sitting down and writing and hammering out 20 messy pages does tend to lead me to a greater understanding of what those pages should really look like. So the plotting comes primarily from writing itself and then revising substantially. And as for point of view, well, some books of mine have multiple points of view. Others just have one. Like Aminata holds the point of view for the entirety of the Book of Negroes. I like to think that the point of view is richest when it's given to somebody who has a lot to lose. And so, somebody who's got a lot at stake, somebody who's vulnerable, somebody who has a lot to lose is likely to catch the interest and the attention of a reader more than somebody who's just crushing all their enemies and is vanquishing all foes and having no problems in life because they're super strong. So I'm interested in people who are vulnerable and who are dealing with their vulnerabilities, and that often leads me to a really rich point of view.
Great, thank you for that. I have one more question here. There's been actually a few folks that wanted some clarification. You mentioned a documentary, and we just wanted to confirm the name of that documentary.
Oh, yes. It's by Cheryl Foggo, Foggo. It's a National Film Board documentary just out, and it's called John Ware is W-A-R-E, John Ware Reclaimed. So if you go on the National Film Board site, you'll probably find it there. Cheryl Foggo is the director and the writer of the film documentary, John Ware Reclaimed. And John Ware, by the way, you can learn about him if you just Google. He's a very well-known Black cowboy, W-A-R-E, a really interesting story.
At WWII, we created a nice animated video as a part of a series, and we featured him. Cheryl has been sharing a lot online as well, and I know that I was able to see it as part of the Art Gallery of Hamilton Film Festival, and Cheryl did share that it's going to be available through a film festival in Yukon online for a couple of days coming up. So if people don't want to wait to go and see it, if you're able to to view it through some of these film festivals, I would encourage you to do so, and then watch it again when it gets wide release.
Great, thanks. And I have one more. Let me just find it here. We have some folks that are curious if you've encountered other significant literature, either novels or poetry, on the construction of the AK Highway and soldiers' involvement. Example works like Norman Roston's The Big Road, if you had other suggestions.
Well, there are a lot of books about the construction of the Alaska Highway. There's a couple that deal specifically with the role of Black soldiers in building it. These are not works of fiction that I'm referring to now, but these are works of, scholarly works or works of nonfiction. And if we scroll through the photos just for a second, you're going to see one book. I think it was near the top of the slide collection that provides a pretty. There we are. It's by John Virtue, The Black Soldiers Who Built the Alaska Highway, a history of the 4 U.S. Army regiments in the North. That one came out just a few years ago. So that would be one of the few books that specifically examines the role of Black soldiers in building the highway. Much of the other documentation I've come across, there's another one. That's a great book, The World War II Black Regiment That Built the Alaska Military Highway. And that's basically a book of photos, which are just stunning. And there was this guy named Griggs, I believe, William Griggs, who was a Black soldier and who was also a very talented amateur photographer. And he took stunning pictures of his peers, other soldiers up there building the highway. And so this is a book mostly of photographs of their experiences in the war. And so those are two books that I can refer to that deal specifically with the Black experience building the highway. The other documents and books I've seen are general histories of the highway, with snippets of information about the role that Blacks played in the building of it.
Thank you for that. We do have some younger people joining us today. And one question, with your gift of storytelling and really bringing history to life, how do you pick stories that may resonate with a wide range of ages? This particular participant has a teenage daughter, and they're interested in finding books that aren't a quote for older people.
Like me. Well, let's be frank here. Not every book is going to be appropriate for every reader. The Book of Negroes is not going to be read by 7-year-olds, or 9-year-olds for the most part, just because it's got some really heavy, incredibly painful, difficult issues in it. As will the Midnight Men novel that I'm writing about the Alaska Highway. So not every book is going to be appropriate for all readers, and that's okay. I'm actually working on a children's novel right now, which is just about done. I'm finishing about the 9th revision, and I think I'm going to be done with it after that or close to it. And it's about a very tempestuous relationship between a young Black girl who finds herself alone in a forest without any other adults there. She doesn't know how she got there, where she comes from, and her relationship with a 700-pound crocodile that she's not sure whether this crocodile is going to eat her or become her best friend, and she has to work that out before they go on a big journey together. So it's another journey story. But I mean, sometimes you have to look for children's literature, depending on how young the child is. And other times, of course, children start moving when they're ready, whether they're 9, 10, 13, 15, they start moving into adult literature. And that depends so much on the child. But there's a wealth of Black literature in this country and in other countries, some, of course, for adults and others for children.
All right, another one just about your writing process. Somebody is asking, do you have a particular routine when you're researching and writing your stories, and can you share that with us?
Well, I sometimes joke about the researching part. A routine is partly spurred by fear that I'll disappear into the stacks of the Robarts Library at the University of Toronto and never come out until I have a 400-year-old beard growing there, because I got so distracted in the research I never did any work. And I say playfully, kind of teasingly to Natasha, that research can be a great way of getting nothing done. And I'm a bit self-mocking when I say that, because of course you need to do the research, but ultimately, if you're doing so much research and never do the writing, then what's the point of it? And so you have to sort of cut it off and have some confidence that you've got enough to write your story and just go forward. And so I do a great deal of research, but I try to just get writing from the get-go and not let the research sort of take over for years. But I try to do it simultaneous to the writing process. Otherwise, I'll just never finish that book, and I'll just get so intimidated by the volume of things to learn that I'll never get the work done. So I try to do both at the same time.
I was just laughing because, so for me, researching about history and writing about history is a little different, but you get lost in the archives reading all of the other things, not necessarily related to my research. Getting on a microfilm and reading some of the old newspapers and looking at what they used to talk about, something that, you take up a lot of my time in the archives.
Yeah, and of course, sometimes the thing that you weren't looking for becomes the richest discovery of all. And so it's important to be open to those lateral, unexpected discoveries too. Just like scientists discover things, scholars and artists also discover things unexpectedly as they just look at the books on the shelf right beside the one they were pulling off.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions, Megan?
I've got one for you, Natasha. So it comes from one of our participants. Natasha, the name of the artist you spoke of is Robert Bork, who my young daughter Katie would love to hear a bit about, your main character in your new novel. Can you share a name and a bit about them? Can you speak a bit more about the intersection of both Black, Indigenous, and Japanese workers during this time?
Oh, so that's for both of us.
It's a bit of a question.
So I think the name was for me, but the question was for Lawrence. Thanks for that.
Well, I mean, we need to remember that in the time of the war, Japanese Canadians are being interned, a gross violation of their human rights. Many of these people have been born and raised in Canada and are landowners and business people. They're stripped of their possessions and of their land. Some of the richest, most valuable land in all of Canada is taken from them, and they never get it back. And they're in turn basically jailed, during the course of the Second World War. And the same thing happens to Japanese Americans in the war. And there's a great paranoia. There's a great fear of the Japanese, including Japanese Canadians during the war, because the Japanese from Japan are our enemies in the war, and they've attacked Pearl Harbor, and And of course, because they've attacked Pearl Harbor, the fear is that they'll go after Alaska next because it's so close to Japan and so weakly defended. What would be more natural than to take Alaska? And in fairness, they do attack the long stretch of islands off the edge of Alaska, which are called the Aleutian Islands, and which is part of North America. And there is fighting between Japanese and Americans in the Aleutian Islands during the Second World War, hand-to-hand combat. But there's a great fear of and hatred of and racism directed toward Japanese Canadians during the war, and for which finally our government apologized, many decades later. And so this fear is what's driving the construction of the Alaska Highway. It seems to me kind of ironic and sad and really striking that the lowest people in the totem pole in the hierarchy, I should say, of the American Army, private soldiers who are Black, who aren't even allowed to carry arms, who are under-equipped, are the ones who are sent up to invade and cross over and build over the lands of Indigenous people in BC and Yukon. It's just so ironic that those who are sort of on the receiving end of the most racial abuse in the American Army are those who end up perpetuating some of the same abuse by building this highway over the lands of Indigenous people. So it is a fascinating intersection of cultures as this highway is being built. And of course, that's one of the stories that grabs me the most.
Thanks. Natasha, is there any information that you can share with us about your PhD research? And what are some of the activities of the Ontario Black History Society, or how can folks get involved?
Hey, well, thanks for that. I'll share our slide there, shortly in the Ontario Black History Society, or if I can ask Elizabeth to pull that up. My research is called One to Many, and it looks at, as I said, the history of the enslavement of Black people in Ontario from about 1760 until 1834. And I do have a little bit on my website. I've been engaging in, I've been asked to present a number of talks recently on my research, and so I'm happy to have those opportunities to share. I think it was 2 weeks ago now, I did a presentation on looking at some of the African people who were enslaved in Essex County, in the Windsor, Detroit area, which was once all British territory. I do have a presentation coming up next the 17th, and that's through the Toronto Workers Project. And in that presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the Black people who were enslaved in early Toronto, as Toronto, when it was the center of government, the seat of government, and this emerging urban center. So taking a look at some of the men, women, and children who were enslaved there. And as I continue to work on my dissertation to write and to research, once it's completed, I do intend to share it more widely, and I do intend to create a database that will be available to the public, because this history, believe it or not, is not well known and hasn't been documented comprehensively in a way that some work, for example, that has been done in Quebec and in the Maritimes. And so I really want to make that contribution to documenting these stories and these narratives so that they are preserved for the future. So look forward to that. I continue to share. And if you can, Elizabeth, move down to this slide with the Ontario Black History Society. I mentioned about the campaign that we just launched a couple of weeks ago. We are spending a lot of time as well continuing to develop resources to disseminate. With everyone, COVID has changed our how we're doing things recently. If you notice the picture, Lawrence, I see you smiling with the picture. And so what we're doing is we're revamping our website to have more materials available on there, but you can visit there now, and there are some resources such as the video project I told you about that we work with Ryerson University, including a profile of John Ware, Viola Desmond, and a number of Black innovators and entrepreneurs. And we continue to make our work available on our website. We're going to be hosting some presentations and lectures and having some guest speakers relating to Black history. So if you connect with us on our website, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, you'll continue to learn more about the wonderful work that we continue to do during our 43rd year. Oh, Lawrence was going to say something about the picture. You got to unmute.
Go back to that picture. I just want to tell people what we're seeing in that really cool shot. That's around 1970 or 80. I was there for that picture. And could we go back to it for a second, Elizabeth? And so on the left is my father, Daniel G. Hill. And then beside him is Lorraine Hubbard, who is very active with the OBHS as well. And Lorraine also has African Canadian heritage. I can't remember, I'm not sure who the fellow is beside Lorraine, but this is the funny part. On the far right is the Attorney General of Ontario, Roy McMurtry. Now, my father never voted Conservative in his life. He was an avid NDPer, but somehow he managed to get Roy McMurtry, a Conservative Attorney General of Ontario, to support the work of the Ontario Black History Society to come out to this reception and so forth. So he was really proud that he could kind of bridge this huge political divide. I mean, he'd put up an NDP sign in every election going on our front lawn in Toronto, the only such sign, I think, within a square mile of our house. But anyway, it made me smile because we've got a kind of a conservative and an NDP and a whole cluster of different ideologies in the same picture, all celebrating the work of the Ontario Black History Society.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that, Lawrence.
I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Lawrence and Natasha, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I just want to say I'm really grateful to the Mississauga Library and also, of course, to Natasha for doing this. And I mean, we're in a time when people are so isolated, and it's great to connect with you. And I hope we manage to keep reconnecting and to find ways to discuss all sorts of interesting aspects of Black history and Black art. And I wish you all the best with your dissertation. I know what a long haul that is, and I'll try to keep going on my projects too.
Yes, thank you, Lawrence. It was great to have this conversation, another conversation with you, but to have it on this platform for others to hear with us and to kind of, help build community and connections. And I do want to thank you for the work that you've done, through literature, yes, through novels, but you still have found a remarkable way of capturing Black history and bringing people into the fold to learn more about Black history. So thank you, and looking forward to the new project. So keep pressing away as much as you can. No pressure. And, I want to thank the Mississauga Museums, Elizabeth, Megan, and Saima for inviting us to participate in this evening, and looking forward to seeing you all again. So thank you.
Thank you too. And thank you to the Mississauga Museums.
It's our pleasure. So we did get some questions as well about, where do we see this recording? Where do we watch this again? Can we share this with our students in our classrooms? So I just wanted to address that we are recording this talk tonight, so we will be sharing it on the museum's website. Right now, if you are interested in the exhibitions we have on view or any of the other speaker events that we have coming up, please visit us, mississaugaculture.ca/warflowers. Again, it's mississaugaculture.ca/warflowers. And I want to just again reiterate my thanks to you, Lawrence and Natasha, for sharing your incredible perspectives with us this evening and for the great work that you are doing.
Excellent. And thank you, everyone. On behalf of Mississauga Library, Thanks to our audience, for all 400 of you tonight for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Just a reminder, you can borrow Lawrence Hill's books from Mississauga Library and ebooks via Libby by Overdrive. As we exit the event, you will be taken to our website for a very brief survey. We would really appreciate your feedback. Please let us know what you thought of tonight's event. And we look forward to seeing all of you at next week's Author Talk with Michelle Good, which you can register for on Active Mississauga.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone.
And
Thank
take
you.
care.
Night.
Bye.
Bye.
Concludes our event. Have a good evening. Good night.
Sleep well. Take care.